Hello, everyone. My name is Malad Tabataba.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Mohammed Bilal Awan.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Nadia Samertuk.
Oh, you were on mute, Samar.
Hi, everyone. This is Simarjot Wadhwa.
And hello, this is Malcolm Lamont.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Our group work for this project is a little bit different. Instead of PowerPoint, we chose this method because of the topic that we chose to talk about, which is leadership for diversity, building a just society. And very specifically, we are talking about Indigenous education and also leadership in education, Indigenous leadership in education. And you know, the discussions here are going to be around those topics, and we wanted to do this in a non-Eurocentric way. So we proposed that this is how we would conduct our research, that each person would conduct a research, and that we would bring that research here to talk about and for discussion, and then for all of you who are watching to gain this knowledge, sharing through this method instead of reading, but also then to reflect on the discussions here, and then to write your feedback based on the questions that we would ask, which are also going to be available in writing the questions, so you don't have to write the questions as we ask them throughout the video. To start us off, we are going to play a video that is just over 3 minutes to give us all some grounding about what who Indigenous peoples are in the country, in Canada, or on these lands that are called Canada. And then after we watch that video, we would go into some context of what we all are going to talk about. Malcolm?
Okay, I think I have it here. Oops. Sorry, just one moment. Technical difficulties. I think I've got it now.
Reconciliation. It's a word you often hear, especially when discussing the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. But in light of recent events, some aren't sure they even want to talk about reconciliation anymore. When a 15-year-old Anishinaabe girl was found dead, dumped in a river, and no one was held responsible, and a young Cree man was shot dead and the shooter was acquitted. Both of these recent cases have re-exposed a deep rift between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. It's a divide that goes back hundreds of years. When Europeans arrived in North America and began settling the land, they didn't stop at just taking land from Indigenous peoples. They brought with them a policy to snuff out the so-called Indian problem. The first Indian residential schools started opening in the 1870s, the beginning of what some have called the darkest chapter in Canadian history.
What took place in residential schools amounts to nothing short of cultural genocide.
By 1920, the Indian Act was amended to make it mandatory for status Indian children to attend residential school. When their parents refused to send them away, police showed up and forcibly took them. It's estimated that 150,000 children were taken from their families and placed in these schools, where they were stripped of their culture and their language. The goal was assimilation, to quote, kill the Indian in the child. Thousands of children died, with some estimates saying the mortality rate was as high as 60% in some of the schools. Those who survived have shared horrific stories of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. The last residential school closed in 1996. The impacts of those institutions are still palpable today. Indigenous communities have shown incredible resilience in the centuries since Europeans arrived, but the impacts of intergenerational trauma and colonization still run deep. In 2007, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history recognized the damage inflicted by residential schools. Canada formally apologized the following year.
These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
The residential school settlement agreement established a multi-billion-dollar fund to support survivors in their recovery. One of the outcomes of this agreement was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The commission traveled across the country and heard testimony from thousands of residential school survivors. In 2015, the commission produced its final report. It included 94 calls to action, calls meant to redress the legacy of the residential school system and hopefully lead to reconciliation. So what's changed since then? Some ask if this country has even grasped the truth of our shared history. What actions have been taken? How far have we come? Indigenous people currently account for roughly 5% of the population, and yet nearly half of all the children in care in this country are Indigenous. More than a quarter of the adults locked up in prisons are Indigenous. The national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls may be well underway, but the deaths and disappearances continue today. It's time to take a hard look at this country's progress on reconciliation.
Thank you. Welcome. So I'm going to start by acknowledging where I live and where I'm tuning in from today. And I'm tuning in from Markham, Ontario, which is covered by Williams Treaty and Johnson-Butler Purchase, which has been and continues to be the ancestral lands of many Anishinaabe First Nations. And with that, my question, one question of this discussion for all of you is to, if you are living on Turtle Island, is to identify the land that you're on, which Indigenous peoples live there, or which Indigenous peoples ancestral land that is that you're on, and to do a little bit of research about whether it's part of a treaty land or not, and if it is, what kind of which treaty it is, and what the treaty, who the treaty signers are, right? It's usually the Crown and a number, one or more than one First Nation. So we want you to do some of that work because in understanding relationships and leadership and diversity in this country, that is one of the most important things. And every institution in Canada that I know of at least has a land acknowledgement piece on their website, at least, or in their events where they do acknowledge whose land they're on. So the discussions today, I will start our discussions about Indigenous land and Eurocentric education. Where does Indigenous education come from, and why does Indigenous leadership in education is important? And then I will pass it over to Bilal, who will talk about 4 challenges Indigenous learners face in Canada. Nadia and Samar will talk about some context within Indigenous education in their provinces where they are located, so in Nunavut and Newfoundland. And then Malcolm will, in conclusion, discuss details of Indigenous knowledge as a component of school curriculum. And Indigenous knowledge and curriculum is part of the recommendations, calls to action that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission gave Canada. And so with that, I want to jump into to my portion of the presentation, and that is Indigenous land. First, I want to encourage all of you to do some research about land, as I've mentioned, as part of the question you're answering. You know, with my research, the research that I've done, you know, I've realized that Canada's Indigenous peoples were here before the Europeans came, and that their lands were never conquered, right? So, so some people might think, well, the Europeans came here and they fought the Indigenous people, so they took over and it's fine, so let's get over it. But that did not happen. They were never conquered. So when the Europeans came here, they, you know, they realized that, you know, it was hard, or it was costly, or maybe they couldn't actually take over these lands, right? Because Indigenous peoples were here, and they had sovereignty, they had governance, so they could not just easily take that over. So what they did, they started signing treaties. So in places where they wanted to make a relationship and do trade and live, they started signing treaties. And so that's why, you know, I'm asking, like, find out which treaty, you know, you're on, and you might find that where you live, there is no treaty. So those are called unceded land. And it's interesting that I found this through my research, that there is a recent court ruling in 2014, so on June 26, 2014, for the first time in Canadian history, the Supreme Court of Canada declared the Chakotay Nation Aboriginal title to a portion of the territory within an area in BC. And this decision allows for full ownership, benefit, and control of the Aboriginal title area by the Chakotay people. And that's significant to me because it really confirms that the Crown sovereignty in Canada, or the government, I guess, I don't know how to explain that, I guess, is not absolute, right? So you might think, you know, we might think that, well, Canada is Canada today, right? And so that all these lands in this country are Canada's, but that's not the case. So you have many cases before the Supreme Court on land, and Indigenous peoples are reclaiming their land that was stolen from them. And some of those treaties are there to really hold accountable Canada in terms of what those relationships should be, right? And what the meaning is for Canada to take over some of those treaty lands. So the treaties don't fully mean that, don't always mean that, well, they just bought the land. No, there's actually a relationship that needs to be maintained, and the terms of that relationship are outlined through those treaties. So, so we are treaty people, and that we need to learn about those treaties if we are going to be effective leaders or understand diversity within the context of living, working, studying on these lands, and also to be a part of the education system. So aside from talking about the land, the Eurocentric knowledge that is now central to all education systems in Canada, secondary, K-12, as well as post-secondary, is, you know, in my view and in my research, is one recent viewpoint. It's one recent strategy that really actually doesn't work on Indigenous land, because again, when Canada talks about reconciliation, they need to, and as you saw, the previous Prime Minister mention that the Indigenous ways of being, may have been in the past seen as inferior. For true reconciliation, Canada, and we are all part of it, we need to recognize that Indigenous education and Indigenous knowledge is I would go as far as saying superior because we are Indigenous land. But what I will say is that we need to recognize that the Eurocentric knowledge and education is not superior to Indigenous knowledge and education. So that's really important for educators to understand and acknowledge. And that's why the calls to action really include a lot of pieces on curriculum and in the Indigenous curriculum in the system. And Malcolm will talk about one strategy of how that might look like in Canada. And there is a lot already happening, but it's the pace is really slow, and the knowledge is not really out there for the current generation. So, talking about Indigenous education, Indigenous knowledge, I'm also going to quote from Dr. Marie Batiste that Indigenous knowledge do not come from within a book and do not come from a Eurocentric research. They come from Indigenous peoples, from their continued living on the land and their continued relationships with each other. And these relationships are maintained through ceremony, culture, language, and heritage. So if we understand that, then we can really understand that to truly bring Indigenous knowledge and education to the education sector, we need to have Indigenous leaders. And that we need to build relationships. All post-secondary institutions, all secondary education systems in Canada need to understand their roles and responsibility, and they need to build relationships with Indigenous peoples, and that they need to have leadership at the top of their organizations, because this is a relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people that is going to accomplish reconciliation, that is going to accomplish having education about Indigenous history, right, in the system, because the history that we have now is written by the Europeans. The history that is there now is not the correct version. So that relationship needs to be built, and so that we all allowing us to move forward to reconciliation with that leadership. And so with that, I will, I think, end my discussion, and I'll pass it over to Bilal, who will talk about 4 challenges Indigenous people face in this country when it comes to education. Bilal.
Thank you very much, Milad, and thank you very much for organizing this session. Hi, this is Bilal again. I'll tell about myself. Originally, I'm from a land named as Taxi Shila, just a history, ancient history. Nowadays, it's called as Taxila. That's very near to Islamabad in Pakistan. So why I'm referring to this or mentioning it, because it is one of the oldest civilizations known as Gandhara, and the world's first organized university was founded in this city. And that was well before Alexander the Great as well. So that's why I have a strong connection with the educational leadership in terms of the land I belong to, and I feel for the Indigenous people here as well. For the last 2 to 3 years, I'm here and living in St. John's, Newfoundland, Labrador. And I was mentioning to my group members that even living after like for 6 months in Canada in 2018 when I moved here. I didn't know that there is a city, St. John's, even Newfoundland, Labrador. Rather, I get to know about Nunavut or Yukon. So there is kind of a gap of communication where the mainland, the skyscrapers, that Canada which is known for today is well promoted in outside world, but the as Milad mentioned about the original people who kind of own this place, this land. Uh, I was at least unaware about that. So coming back to Newfoundland, Labrador, we have the second largest indigenous population of all the Atlantic provinces, and almost 46,000 people identify themselves as indigenous. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the factual data I obtained. And according to the 2016 census data, out of these 46,000, 94% of the indigenous people, they live off reserve. So here, walking the two worlds, or indigenous versus the non-indigenous lifestyles and cultures. So 94% of the people are living off reserve, or they're forced to do that. Before I get into the details of the challenges, I just want to shortly or precisely comment on the video that was played earlier in the session, that here sometimes we go to the hotels because it's just 3 to 4 minutes away from here, the Holiday Inn, and towards the airport as well. I come across so many Aboriginal people who come for vacation time to the city of St. John's, and I lived myself in a small community in Labrador of Fortu, and I came across the Aboriginal people. I felt there is a hesitation in their behavior to get integrated with the other people, and that hesitation is not only from their side. The circumstances were created that they are reluctant now, and that is one of the major challenges I will present. So that video, when I saw those faces of the victims and all the other members of these indigenous populations, I still feel there is a disconnect between those Canadians portrayed on the media and the social media, and the real Canadians. We still have, as an immigrant, I'm a third party immigrant. I mean, I'm the third person. The first one were the original Canadians, like the Aboriginals, then the Europeans, and now we are the third kind of generation. But the first two, the host and the first immigrants, they also have a disconnect, and we feel as well that the indigenous people are not well integrated and socialized to the outer world, and there is a high need of support in that regard. So coming back to the challenges, there are numerous challenges faced by the indigenous learners. I'll talk specifically about the learners and accessing the secondary and the post-secondary education of Canada. Yes, there is a need of designing the curriculum that well fits within their traditional style, their lifestyle, and they don't feel that as an imposement onto them. But some of these challenges I chose for this session is because of the reason that first, like if we're not realizing and acknowledging a problem, that will not start the process of providing a solution on that. I'm sorry. So the first one is the reluctance and hesitation. As I mentioned earlier, commenting on that video. So there is a reluctance shown by the indigenous people in moving away from their hometowns. I'm not generalizing my personal opinion, but I extracted it from articles, and that from their hometowns and their territories for a secondary and post-secondary education. One can say that this is like a one-sided problem at the macro level from the administrative perspective, but that will not be the full picture, because Canadian Indigenous people are still, I mean, will be recognized as Indigenous because of the perseverance of their social, their cultural, and their traditional values that strongly binds them to their hometowns, and their hesitation is justified. That if they move away to metropolitan spaces, there is a greater chance of losing that identity that they have been preserving for hundreds of years. So that is number one. So secondly, the anxiety they feel about transitioning into the urban spaces, because there is a fear of unacceptability based on the racial exclusion, and on top of that, they have a fear of disrespect of their culture and their traditional values. So talking about first acknowledging these problems, then the gap we just talked about between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, the gap that exists for the Aboriginal education is not only a human rights issue, but it has also associated economic problems as well. So mitigating and reducing the impacts of these challenges are very much significant to help the Indigenous people to improve their skill set for better employment opportunities, not only in the non-Indigenous spaces, but also in their own territories, for long-term infrastructural development, and so that their culture and traditional values can be preserved, with an amalgamation of modern world facilitation, like better health system, and reducing the marginalization, and then bringing prosperity to these communities. So from a broader perspective, narrowing this gap down between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities on educational platforms, because we are discussing the education itself, that will ultimately promise the economic growth by lowering down the unemployment rate, and by improving the overall GDP. Here I want to mention that the IRCC, because right now I'm working on deputation with the immigration department, so I had a chance to see it from a closer perspective, that every year they're setting high targets for their immigration needs. When the people of Canada already, it can be my personal opinion, but what I saw it as a solution to the problem, that rather bringing people from outside, we have a lot of human resource that can be transformed into well-equipped and skilled human resource, and we can Canada can incorporate and Canada can utilize that for their filling up the jobs and providing better options to the indigenous people as well. So therefore, providing the indigenous people with all these opportunities, they can play their role in strengthening the overall economy. So, but this again, this is only possible when the challenges faced by the indigenous people pursuing education, secondary and post-secondary in specific, are acknowledged and addressed accordingly. I will be concluding my session and handing over to Nadia, but I want to present a question for the discussion within this group and the other fellow members of the program. Whether the question is that whether Indigenous learners should be provided secondary and post-secondary education in their territories, or should they leave their spaces and go to urban spaces? Which way is more beneficial, or a win-win situation? So I'll conclude and hand over to Nadia for the rest of the presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Bilal. I thought that was very interesting. Sorry, I'll fix it in a bit. My 4-year-old is just playing over here, so you might be able to hear her in the background. So my discussion, so my name is Nadia Samartok. I'm from Iqaluit Nunavut, and I am originally from this territory. Just give me a second. So I'm originally from Rankin Inlet, Nunavut, but I've lived here in Iqaluit for quite a few years, and I've lived back and forth. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can you just give me a second? My connection is not that great today, so hopefully it works out. Okay, can you guys see that? Okay, so my discussion is focused more on Nunavut education. And I just kind of put together like the main points of an article that I found online written by Heather McGregor. And she's actually she actually grew up here in Iqaluit. So I found that her information was quite relevant to what I relate to as an Inuk person in Nunavut, as an Inuk educator as well. So basically the article topic is on a comparison of the history of education with more current issues of education in Nunavut. It brings forward important distinctions of Nunavut education. And the main focus is on 4 areas of common struggle that we often face up north. Those 4 areas are walking into worlds, human resource development, decolonization, and radical implementation and radical pedagogy. So the main research goal of this article, I'll just quote what McGregor had written. It says, I believe the circumstances of education in Nunavut largely focused on changing education to better benefit Inuit students, families, and communities, provides an important location from which to contribute and perhaps strengthen ideas about walking into worlds, securing the right education, human resources, decolonizing schools, and moving forward with greater reliance on Indigenous educational pedagogy. So I wanted to talk about some general history about Nunavut because, as I mentioned in our group, us here in Nunavut, we often feel kind of like we're kind of isolated from the rest of the country. I mean, physically we are quite isolated. There's no highways in and out of Nunavut. The only way in and out of Nunavut is through air travel, right? Which can be quite expensive. So Nunavut is Canada's most dispersed and isolated territory. In terms of its physical, screens are cutting off. Mental, emotional, and social realms. Emotional factors contribute largely to its challenges and opportunities. Nunavut is a fairly new territory. It was created in 1999. Originally, we were a part of the Northwest Territories. Many Inuit traditions, such as hunting and camping, are still commonly practiced. So it's quite common today for many of our people to be living still practice our traditional ways that our parents and grandparents did. So moving on to some educational history, McGregor listed some of the critical aspects of Inuit education, which includes environmental knowledge, experiential learning, caring between teacher and learner, as well as family control over child rearing. And what that means is traditionally raising our children was more of like a family duty sort of thing, which is still pretty common today, I would say. So I hope my daughter is not too distracting. The plan this morning was to have her go to her grandparents, but they're not feeling well. And in the days of COVID, you know, it's not something that we wanted to risk, but hopefully my presentation is okay. Some more educational history about in education in Nunavut. So for the Arctic, colonization began in the 1940s, which is not too long ago. My parents actually were born in the 40s and they're still living today. This colonization resulted in quick and drastic changes that played a role in dismissing the traditional approaches and outcomes of Inuit education. And here in Nunavut, or back then it was Northwest Territories, the federal government began a residential school program. Wait, give me a second. The federal government began a residential school program in 1955, and that just applies to us here. This led Inuit children to not be able to take part in their traditional land-based education as they were sent away to residential schools or day schools. Peter Elnep, he's actually quite a well-known politician who went to residential school with my father. He stated that children were taught that in a modern world, their Inuit language and culture were unacceptable. So back then, most elders, most elders grew up on the land, so therefore schooling as children was new to them. And even for my parents as well, schooling was new to them when they were young adults as well, although they both did go to residential school. It was more like the concept was new to them. And just to add on to that, I wanted to talk about an experiment. I don't know if anybody has heard about a video called Experimental Eskimos, where 3 young men were taken from Nunavut by the federal government, and they were taken down as an experiment in the 1960s. The experiment was, the idea or the main idea of the experiment was to kind of assimilate them to Southern living and to see how they react, I guess, or if they would be able to assimilate to Southern life. So one of those young men actually was my uncle, Eric Taguna. And so that just kind of, I thought that was kind of like an interesting bit to add to my discussion on educational history. During the beginning of the recognition of Nunavut as a new territory, the Inuit way of speaking, their practice and their traditions were still a significant way of life and were maintained through oral tradition. Administrative responsibility for education was transferred completely from the federal government to the Northwest Territories in between 1969 to 1970, which kind of paved the way, or was part of the paving of the way towards the creation of Nunavut in 1999. Okay, so some current issues, some arguments that McGregor had spoken about in her article are, for example, Aboriginal continue to be invisible. Not enough progress has been made towards Indigenous consciousness, language, and culture in public schools. Realization of Indigenous knowledge in learning programs was still lacking, except through the dedicated efforts of individuals such as elders, community leaders, and professionals. Baptiste and Henderson, who McGregor referenced in her article, have also argued that few professional schools, universities, or educational systems across Canada have made naturalization of Indigenous knowledge a priority in their Eurocentric knowledge curricula. So another group member of ours had mentioned this as well. So some examples of, more examples of current issues in education today here in Nunavut. There's often a large staff turnover. And as an educator, I experience this as well. I see it happening, and there are often educators who come up to the north to teach, but they stay for a year, right? And it's the same in healthcare. We have a doctor who will come up north, stay for a year, and then we have a new one the next year, and so on. So retaining staff members is not something that has been easy for us to do. Infrequent visits from departmental support personnel in dispersed communities makes it difficult to implement new initiatives. Inuit Kalyamayadukamit are a set, or IQ, are a set of guiding principles that are defined by elders up here as knowledge that has been passed on to us by our ancestors, things that have always known, things crucial to our survival, patience, and resourcefulness. So IQ is considered by Inuit as a theory of knowledge. Therefore, education for Inuit cannot be confined by Western theories of knowledge. And I'll touch on what Inuit Kalyamayadukamit refers to on the next page. So Inuit Kalyamayadukamit, or IQ, are the foundation of the Nunavut education framework. So for example, I won't go through them all. I'll just kind of give it a little bit of information. Sorry guys, I hope my daughter is not too noisy back there. Can you guys hear her? She's not very happy right now.
It's great, Nadia.
Is it okay?
It's fine.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, in the days of COVID, I just didn't want to risk sending her over to grandparents this morning, but so an example of Inuit Kalyamayadukamit in education, the first one is called Inuit Kadigit, which means respecting others' relationships and caring for people. Tunganang nek, fostering good spirits by being open, welcoming, and inclusive. Biitsong nek, serving and providing for family and or community. So I won't go through them all. However, these guiding principles that the government or our people have mandated as our guiding principles have been used as the foundation of our Nunavut education framework, and we've been able to kind of find ways to integrate them into our schools directly through activities, even just assignments, differentiating assignments, sort of thing. Okay, so the 4 areas of common struggle that McGregor had mentioned. The first one is called Walking in Two Worlds, and it says, for schools that have majority Indigenous population and take on a commitment to reflect culture in learning, this challenge does not just mean presenting 2 sides to the history of settlement of North America. It means asking elders for their advice and then seeking ways to translate that advice. It means making choices about how much time is spent in the computer lab versus how much time is spent on a land trip. It means making choices between preparing students for community life, using their language and local practices, and preparing students for post-secondary education or employability outside their communities. It means the flexibility to discuss modern human rights and multiculturalism in the same conversation as cultural notions of responsibility responsibility and Indigenous sovereignty. It means encouraging students to be critical of the world around them in ways that may not have been traditionally part of Inuit practice, and yet respectful of that which is sacred in their culture and other cultures. It means helping people understand that traditional need not be synonymous with old or unchanging, and that choosing to sustain tradition may not be simply conservative, but also activist. So a quote that, I thought was interesting. McGregor referenced Marker that says, these ideological conflicts related to local knowledge and history reveal the most extreme challenges to schools wishing to create a context of Indigenous cultural responsiveness. Moving on to the second common struggle, human resource development. So the goal of the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement was to employ an Inuit population of 85%. However, as of 2011, only 51% had been reached. And one of the criticisms of that is that unrealistic government policies are not supported by human resource development programs. So for example, training and retaining Inuit educators has become a barrier to the implementation of the IQ-based policy. There's just not been a lot of resources available to us that are relevant to the Inuit. And they're just, we're often looking around, and we are in the process of creating more resources that are relevant to us up here. So it is happening. It's just, it's a very long and tedious process. Decolonization, sorry, oops, I lost my screen. Oh, there we go. Decolonization doesn't necessarily mean an education system being closed completely to the Western world. It just means increasing community engagement with members, such as parents and elders. And it means acknowledging what has occurred in the colonial past and its ongoing impacts. So it is happening, as I mentioned earlier. It's just, it is a very long and it is a touchy subject when we talk about, for example, residential schools, but we are working actively up here to kind of find a way to kind of decolonize as much as we can within our schools. I personally, I hope it happens very soon. However, it is a lot. It is a lot of work, and there's a lot of information that we need to, get going there. And decolonization also means providing teaching and learning opportunities that allow more space for Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. And the last common struggle identified by McGregor was called radical implementation and radical pedagogy. So here she says that educational change requires radical disruption and some ideas for changes that could be made to better reflect the dynamics of an Indigenous school for Indigenous students. And these are just very few examples of what could be done. The ways in which schools operate, changes to daily schedules, and the annual calendar. And I wanted to add on to that a bit, is by the annual calendar, I mentioned earlier that traditional ways of living are still quite common up here. It's normal for everybody to just head out hunting and, catch something for supper sort of thing. But when we think about the migration patterns of our food sources up here, we need to kind of follow their migration patterns as well. And Inuit are historically, we're a nomadic people, right? So the assignment of students into grades, course options available to students, the nature of relationships between administration, teachers, and students, standardized assessments, and use of program funds. And by program funds, that could be funds that go towards like a cultural camp sort of thing. So that is the end of my discussion on education in Nunavut. I do have a question for you, which will be available in writing as well. So my question for you guys is, in terms of social justice and diversity, and with keeping in mind what I've presented on education in Nunavut, how can we as leaders in the education system seal the gap between the two worlds experienced by many Indigenous students? So I'll leave you at that, and then I'll pass it on to Simar.
Thank you, Nadia. This was actually the entire content was very knowledgeable. And it's really great to know that you yourself belong to the lands of Indigenous ancestry. And we are here to learn and learn so many things from you.
Sorry, Samar, just a technical issue. Nadia, do you mind if you're already stopping screen share? Thank you. Great.
Okay, do I start?
Yes, there was just that one thing. Thanks, Samar.
Thank you. Okay, I'm like winding up from Nadia's like discussion here, starting again. Of course, when we acknowledge this lands of indigenous ancestry, so the question comes: what is the like inclusion from point of view of indigenous education? Are we really like involving them socially or academically or politically into the system, in the government system as well as in the academic system over here? To start with here, my discussion really goes with the Memorial University of Newfoundland, its own commitment to promotion of indigenous education, and even Newfoundland government's efforts and endeavors to incorporate indigenous education, even like establishment of indigenous schools, and then in those schools that is like imbibing curriculum into it. And then of course the federal government steps later on too. So to begin with, Memorial University, that we are all the students here, and
Okay, welcome back. Sorry, technical issues. Our group member Samar, it seems maybe the very strong winds in St. John's today have possibly knocked out her power, but she's dropped from our group chat. So we'll be posting in an appendix in an addition on the page that we'll be sending out with the discussion questions. She's got 2 videos, one by Dr. Anderson, and some videos for your consideration that were a little bit longer that we couldn't include in today's presentation. So for my component of today's presentation, it was a look at incorporating Indigenous knowledge in curriculum. And so I was able to source a textbook, a book called What is Indigenous Knowledge? Voices from the Academy, sorry. What is Indigenous Knowledge? Voices from the Academy. And it covered, it's from 1999, so a little bit already quite old, relatively speaking. And within this textbook, there were a number of chapters, and I focused on third chapter, which was to do with Indigenous knowledge and as a component of the curriculum. So my discussion focuses on how, based on the research of this article, of this chapter, text chapter, and how that, how we can incorporate the authors of this chapter. The author of this chapter looked at how they incorporated Indigenous knowledge on the islands of Trinidad and Tobago, in the country Trinidad and Tobago, into curriculum on the island. And by curriculum, they mean westernized, academic, as Milad mentioned, Eurocentric knowledge curriculum. So the chapter first starts with a small discussion about how Indigenous knowledge, because of its nature of being an oral tradition, and it also mentions being in parts formed by intuition and creativity, and that it's a difficult construct or difficult concept to explain. But then it goes on to say that parts, kind of the core principles of Indigenous knowledge, which is experiential knowledge, and the core concepts of constructivism, which is Piagetian, and basically the lead theory of learning and knowledge and curriculum design, or at least in the program I'm studying, curriculum teaching and learning, the constructivism is the main theory that we're exploring and is largely considered, along with Vygotskian research and Piagetian, to be the main way in which students construct and create learning together. Oh, there's Samar.
Yeah, hi.
Welcome back. So Samar, I'm not sure if the power went out. I'll just finish my topic, and then if you want to carry on with yours.
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
Okay. So in a sense, the authors were arguing that the experiential nature of Indigenous knowledge and the experiential nature. So constructivism is how what students bring to class, adult learners, of course, even high school, secondary, middle school, and perhaps even elementary, what they bring to class and their pre-existing knowledge structures help form with their experience, help form new knowledge and construct new knowledge with what they're being taught in class and the curriculum. So it said that it lent very, if I can kind of paraphrase, it lent itself naturally to the two natures of the ways of learning and ways of knowing. And I'll just share lastly an example that the authors used, which was that of heat. So the authors said that the authors looked at science curriculum. They said that Indigenous knowledge has wide-reaching implications throughout many subjects in their curriculum, but they looked at specifically science. And so this concept of heat, where the villagers, the Indigenous villagers of Trinidad and Tobago, understood heat as a measure that when they were outside in the sun or exercising or even sleeping, they would create heat, and then it was up to the body to restore the natural or restore balance and equilibrium and cool down by relaxing or having cold beverage. And so the Indigenous villagers had their understanding of heat, and the same concept is understood in science curriculum of homeostasis. So where the body reaches too high of a temperature through exercise or through different activities, and naturally instigates a body's reaction of sweating or activities you can do like sitting down or relaxing to dispel the heat and return to homeostasis. So that was the example, curriculum example that authors used to show direct links between Indigenous knowledge and Eurocentric curricular knowledge. So the question I leave for discussion for the group is a Venn diagram. So I'll post this on the discussion page, and on one side of the Venn diagram is Indigenous knowledge, and on the other side of the Venn diagram is curriculum, and then in the middle is where I hope you'll fill in, and it would be great to see how much information we can fill in. You know, as a teacher geek, I get excited about curriculum, and this is a serious topic, but it's also very interesting, and I'm curious to see where we go with filling in the center Venn diagram. So see what we can do. Great, so that's it for me. I'll pass it over to Samar, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Malcolm. So I've reconnected now, so I'll start. Okay, I was talking about Memorial University's approach towards Indigenous education. So I start with their vision. It states, indigenization must be led by Indigenous peoples. This is the only ways of being, doing, and knowing are brought into the institution in a robust and ethical manner. So it is great belief that they really want to imply on. In 2012, Memorial University took a leap in Indigenous education, where it created the Office of Indigenous Affairs, and the second branch was for Indigenous Resource Center at St. John's campus. When we talked about Indigenous Affairs, Office of Indigenous Affairs, and the position of Special Advisor to the President on Indigenous Affairs, identifying the goals that were mentioned in a special obligation, that was a report published in 2009 by Presidential Task Force on Aboriginal Initiatives. Here, the formation of President Advisory Committee also they had in Memorial University. That was on Indigenous Affairs again. It was a very sincere and serious step taken by the university to encourage matters related to academic program, student support services, public engagement, and the development and implementation of the strategic framework for indigenization. It was indeed a very great step towards inclusive education for indigenous people. The framework approved by the Board of Regents that was in March 2021. And of course, the three key concepts that were focused on was indigenization, decolonization, and reconciliation. Then we talked about here, this is that Memorial University first time, like that is especially at the Labrador Institute, started Inuit Bachelor of Social Work program, which was the first of its own kind in entire Canada. If I'm not wrong, and of course was presented with national award. That is Changemakers Initiative, Inspiring Approaches to First Nations. That is an Inuit Learning Award, if I'm correcting it, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, for its innovation, social impact, and Inuit learning. So at the same time, like slightly later, there was even the introduction of Indigenous Bachelors in Education in Memorial University. All these steps were taken to promote the education for the Aboriginals and the people who really deserve it and who were isolated. And of course, it was a great step to include the people, their lands, and their education into the system over here. It was MUN, which was really progressive in its thought initially, and then of course, even because the initial programs, what we get to know is in 2009, when they started with a special obligation, in 2012, when they started with establishment of offices. Even Newfoundland provincial government, they have an approach that is named as the way forward. So what is their vision and what steps they are supposed to take? So, for this, even the education department of the provincial government, they have Indigenous schools opened up where Indigenous curriculum is taken into, is taught over there. And then after that, and of course, focuses the main criteria that what they really focus on 9 areas, and Indigenous education is one of them here. And of course, the provincial approach is towards diversified province with high standard of living. And there was, it was a Premier's task force that provided recommendations to Newfoundland government, focusing on strengths and areas to improve. And yeah. And what Newfoundland government really wanted, and they wanted to focus on, and they are right now also, so that when they quote it, but I quote their words here: Indigenous leaders to know there are real opportunities to work together to make positive change and prepare agenda together with Indigenous governments and organizations. So that was a huge step taken by the provincial government, where they incorporated the systems here for the betterment of the Aboriginals and their lives here. And to what extent it is really implemented, it's an ongoing process. They have done a bit of it, and there's a lot more to be done. And then we talk about the federal government here. Federal government, like there was a case that's mentioned on their site also, whereas in 2007 and 2008, there were 5 class action lawsuits that were filed against the government of Canada, and the lawsuits claimed sexual and physical abuse, neglect, and language and cultural loss. And in context to this, on November 24, 2017, Prime Minister Trudeau, a former student of Newfoundland Residential School, Prime Minister Trudeau apologized to former students of Newfoundland residential schools and their families. and launch the healing and commemoration portion of settlement agreement. And of course, we have Indigenous education and new Indigenous course policy that has been developed by the government, by the provincial government. And these policies, again, it's an ongoing process. Things are changing and things will change. And that's what the Man University or, Memorial University or provincial government or federal government, they really aim at. And I have a question here for discussion. That since we are all the students of the Memorial University, do we all agree with the steps taken by the university to promote Indigenous education, or is there more to be added? You can come up with your views. You can contribute to whatever ideas you really want to really express here. That's what I really wanted to add here. And of course, I've got a little more and I need to really synchronize the things a little more. I'm on my restructuring of things. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Samar. So this nearly brings us to the close of our discussion, our webinar. We were going to have an intra-panel discussion, but just in the interest of time, maybe it's best we save that to the side for another time and open it up for classmates. So we'll have our discussion. I thought maybe if it's all right with everybody, if we could share our question again, so it's all here at the end, and we could go in order from Milad's through to my question that we have for discussion, and then that'll be all closed, and we'll finish after that.
Very good, very good. Thank you, Malcolm. My question is, if you live on Turtle Island, and that is North America, find out whose land, that is which Indigenous people's land you currently live on, and if the land you live on is part of a treaty agreement. If it is, provide a brief overview of the treaty. For example, who are the signatories to the treaty and what are the objectives of the treaty for each signatory nation? If the land you live on is not part of a treaty, or if you don't live on Turtle Island, do you think that the government should have the right to own that land, or the Indigenous peoples who have lived there for thousands of years? And for this part, I've said you don't have to explain the answer because I know my question has so many parts. But if you do provide a rationale for that answer, I'm really interested to seeing those discussions. So.
Yep. Thank you very much, Milad. My question was that whether the Indigenous learners should be provided secondary and post-secondary education within their territories, or should they leave their spaces and go to the urban spaces? Which way is more beneficial for a win-win situation? That was my question, and thank you very much for the session.
Okay, and my question was in terms of social justice and diversity, and with keeping in mind what I've presented on education in Nunavut, how can we as leaders in the education system seal the gap between the two worlds experienced by many Indigenous students? And I'll pass it over to Samar.
Thank you, Nadia. My question was, being a student of Memorial University, do you agree with the steps taken by the university to promote Indigenous education? What more should be initiated by the university to encourage the contribution of the Indigenous people in the Indigenous education? Thank you. Pass on to now Malcolm, please.
Great. And finally, my question is a Venn diagram to fill in what items would fit between Indigenous knowledge and curriculum. So what would we fill in overlapping the two categories, please? Okay, so thanks very much. We can just say goodbye and I'll stop the recording, and I suppose we leave it up to you now in the class discussions. So thanks very much.